All right.
Okay, buenos días, Ian.
Buenos dias, Alex. Please excuse my dog Spanish. But good to see you anyway. And yes, this week we're going to try and talk about time. And we sort of left a question open at the end of last week when
Yes.
we were talking about the one and the many.
Mm-hmm.
Why should why should the one in its perfection ever have decided to be many copies, as it were, that are imperfect? I mean, that is one of the fundamental riddles, I suppose, of the cosmos. To me, it expresses that it is a creative cosmos, that the point of it is to bring diversity, individuality into being in such a way, as I always emphasize, as to do nothing to harm, but on the contrary, to enrich the integrity of the whole, like the unfurling of a flower.
What a fantastic way to actually bridge the previous chapter with this one after we had read that fascinating quote from William James, right?
Yes,
In
yes,
Spanish, we have this expression, vale la pena. When we say something is worth it, we say vale la
yes,
pena, but pena
Penny.
is sorrow. So maybe it could
Yes,
be
yes,
tweaked and say, well, why would the one, it's not vale la pena, but
yes,
vale la alegría
yes,
in a positive sense?
yes,
Why decide to do that? And time,
yes,
which is a mystery, is part of the
yes.
solution to that. So the solution or the key to that other mystery in a way.
I like that very much, yes. And of course, the root of suffering is in every kind of feeling. It's in the word passion. It's in the German word Leidenschaft, which is the word for passion. Leiden is to suffer. So that when we feel, we suffer. And the point is that if one has a cosmos which is conscious and can feel, then it is going to involve those, what Blake calls the silken twine of joy and sorrow. And so, yes, vale la pena, but vale la alegría, or
Yes.
whatever. Sorry, again, forgive my
Perfect.
Spanish, but
Perfect.
okay. So that's it. And I think that the point to take on board is that there never was a time, as far as we know, when there was no time. So a lot of physicists, of course, you can never get two physicists to agree about anything, because this is the wonderful state of physics that we are
Mm.
trying to understand something that seems resistant to our normal modes of understanding. But certainly Ilya Prigogine, certainly Lee Smolin, who I think is the physicist who has the most interesting things to say about time, suggests that there is nothing more fundamental than time, that time must pre-exist anything else, that everything must take place in time. And we
Mm.
may talk about that again a little bit. So what I would say in response to James is that there never was a time when there was no time, and that only time can lend the freedom for creativity and life. It's the force field of individuation.
Mm.
And in that sense, it's like what I think Bergson meant by this much understood phrase, the élan vital, this sense of vitality as not stationary,
Mm.
as moving forward
Mm.
with what he calls élan. It's a sort of reaching out,
Mm.
which I think is perfectly comprehensible
Yeah.
and makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the business of a creative cosmos.
And referring to the previous chapter, the elan is also an impulse of differentiation within
Yes,
unity. And that's why it's
yes.
creative, but at the same time, it's not branching out in fragments.
It, that's right. And at the same time, it is neither wholly determined nor entirely random. And that's a very important theme, that we seem always to find that nature, and further than that, the what we think of as perhaps outside of nature but isn't, the inanimate world, seems to have this sense of a going somewhere,
Yeah.
which, in other words, there is potential, but the potential is never known until it is realized.
Mm.
And maybe the point of time is is to move so that the point of realization of the potential comes about.
Yeah. I wasn't planning to go there, but in a way, this evokes in my mind this distinction between the actual and the virtual, or the possible, some people call it the possible, or the potential, and time as this crack where this interface where one flows into the other, where the virtual becomes actualized, but still that doesn't exhaust the real. The real is not just what becomes actualized, but it's this balance between these modes of being in a way.
I think that's exactly right. And perhaps when we come to talk about physicists' various possible ways of thinking about the universe and time, we can come back to that. I think that's a very good point.
Yes. So you start your book with a quote also from James, but also another one from Schopenhauer, which I think is fantastic. And I would like to maybe expand a bit on it. So you write from Schopenhauer that the time is this being that consists in nothing but movement without anything that moves. This is the really hard thing for me to not to understand, but in a way only also to grasp and to hold on to it, movement without anything that moves.
Yes. And it turns out to be a fundamental point, however difficult it sounds. And that's why I start out this chapter with that quote from Schopenhauer. And he goes on talking equally of space. What is space? And we'll talk about that very soon, not in this session. This omnipresent nothing out of which no thing can emerge without ceasing to be something. To think away time and space is completely impossible. Well, it's very easy to think away everything that appears in them. The hand cannot let go of everything, can let go of everything except itself, and comes back to that idea you said of this being hard to grasp. The hand cannot grasp the thing that is most fundamental.
Wow. Yeah.
And I suppose that time is a very, very difficult thing to talk about, but I think that it can be approached very fruitfully through the lens of the hemisphere hypothesis. Because when one looks at the different theories that have been put forward about the nature of time, one finds a number of dualities, if you like, that are commonly those between the right and the left hemisphere. So, for example, there is a big difference between the experience of time, which James and Bergson and Schelling and indeed others have talked about, and its representation, which inevitably spatializes it, geometricizes it, and fixes it in a representation on a sheet, as it were, of paper, or a projection on a screen in which we look at something. And immediately, of course, the time has gone from it by the very fact of representing it. And then there's the distinction between stasis, the attempt to see time as an instant followed by another instant, which one first sees really coming up, I suppose, with Zeno, then with Aristotle, being somehow perplexed by how does stasis ever get to be movement? And yet the flow is not a series of static moments. It's very, very different from that. And this is again a point made by all these philosophers, that it's not a succession of moments. It is a seamless flow in which every part, and I say part in inverted commas because it's only what our left hemisphere makes out of this seamless flow that we call a part, interpenetrates with every other part, and so is not utterly distinct. And this parallels, the difference between a view of time as slices of time versus duration, between temps in Bergson's case and durée. Importantly, it also distinguishes between a universe in which everything is predictable because it's a cause and effect, and we'll perhaps talk about cause and effect a little later, on the one hand, and the uncertainty, which is always the mode of apprehension or comprehension, rather, of the universe by the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere system as one that is effectively closed, in which everything can be referred back to something else within this closed system, and so therefore leading to the idea that everything can be ultimately, or in theory, could be predicted. That contrasted with the right hemisphere's take that nothing is ever fully determined and is always open. And that all these things that they're to do with experience, flow, duration, uncertainty, and openness bring us back to, I think, closer to human experience once we get beyond the ways in which we verbalize about time, and closer to this idea of a creative cosmos bringing forth individual things.
Yes, and in mentioning Bergson's, let's call it dualism, to me it's a new dualism of time and duration, even matter and memory. Bergson is using all these opposed notions, but he's doing it in a way that don't fall prey to kind of a rigid dualism. And I was smiling while reading your chapter, because I realized, well, you're doing in a way the same thing for the hemisphere. So here we have these two entities, and how are we going to articulate our relationship between them so that it's not merely opposition and stuck? And also then there's also these other parts, so there's a duality there, but then, as we also covered very recently, there's an equal relationship, so one can in a way embrace the other, but you cannot go from the other back to that one. So there were these parallels appearing in my reading between those deep philosophical doctrines from Bergson and others, and your own way of presenting the hemisphere hypothesis.
Yes, that asymmetry whereby one can incorporate and accept the other, but the other cannot accept the one, often comes up in Bergson when he distinguishes between what he calls intellect, which is really what we now know to be the left hemisphere in operation, and very, very different from intelligence, because, as you know, the left hemisphere is less intelligent than the right. But what he calls intellect, and what he calls intuition, which is effectively the right hemisphere's immediate grasp of an experiential reality. And he says that it cannot be stated too often. He says one cannot move from analysis to intuition. One cannot move from stasis to motion. One cannot move from parts to create the whole, but once one has the whole, one has the intuition, one can then analyze, which is the second step in my three-part idea of how everything comes into being for us in our phenomenological world, that it originates in a right hemisphere take, which is then processed in helpful ways by the left hemisphere and then taken up again by the right.
Can you say something more about that apropos of the subtitle of your book, The Unmaking of the World?
Well, yes, of course. What I'm getting at there is that because of our enslavement, bewitchment by the left hemisphere's take on the world, it is unmaking the world. It is taking it apart. It is becoming, in various ways, not a world in which we can dwell, but a sort of set of circumstances that we can cognize, like a kind of artificial realm, which is merely diagrammatic, two-dimensional, unliving, fragmentary. And so what I'm suggesting is that this is an anti-life process. And it is interesting that people with schizophrenia, who we've talked about this before, who experience reality in a way that suggests that the left hemisphere is in overdrive and the right hemisphere is deficient, they see the world as unreal. And at the core of this, and this is a point made by many great psychiatrists in the history of the phenomenology of schizophrenia, at the core of this phenomenon seems to be the incapacity to appreciate time. I think when we were looking at the earlier chapters, it's possible that I did comment on the fact, I think I did, that the left hemisphere does not understand time. It tends to slice it and immobilize it and try and pin it down. And of course, as soon as you've done that, you've stopped the essence of time, which is flow. And so it's hardly surprising that schizophrenic subjects who seem to be over-reliant on the left hemisphere don't seem to understand time and don't seem to be able to, as a result of that, understand motion. They don't like motion. A number of them say, I look for immobility. One patient, when asked how she'd got on at home visiting her mother, she said there was motion. I don't really like that. And they seem to see motion as split up into now, followed by another now. So lots of little punctate elements along a line rather than seeing it as a seamless flow. And of course, Bergson calls it, I think he makes this analogy with music. It's very important that time and music have similar qualities, that they seamlessly flow, and that what was before is incorporated in what is present and leads on to a possible future.
This making of time specialized, this specialization of time happens in mathematics. Maybe we talk about it when we deal with physicists' conception of time, but also in language, right? And in you write in this chapter, and you devote a very interesting section of the chapter to talk about things and time as a thing.
Yes.
And it allows to talk about time, but also zoom out and better understand your whole project with the matter of things. And there's a surprise there for the reader about the origin of the word thing in many languages and what it used to mean and what it means now.
Yes. I think it's very instructive to see how our word thing and the word that is equivalent to it in other languages has moved from a reverberative reciprocal human process into an inhuman thing, object that is isolated. And I think the first thing to say about time is that we shouldn't think of things as being in time as though it's a large room or space. Einstein says that we shouldn't think of things as being in space either, but we should think of them as being spatially extended. And I think a good analogy with that is we shouldn't think of things in time, but as whatever it is we mean by things, as extended in time. And interestingly, the word tempus in Latin, from which we get words like temporal and so on, is from a root which means to stretch, so it's something that is extended. And I think I suggest that we should think of time not as a noun. Friedrich Waismann says, many of the problems we have in understanding time come from our trying to puzzle about what is this thing, this noun, whereas in fact it's an adverb that describes the process of being. That being is a being in time, as Heidegger said, that it is something that is extended, and that the timefulness of things, their Zeitlichkeit, as he says, is an aspect of their being. And being, of course, is a gerund, as is Dasein. It's a verbal concept or noun. So yes, well, the history of the word thing, in English at any rate, is that it first comes into the language about the year 1000, and it comes from Norse roots, Icelandic roots. And the most ancient parliament in the world is thought to have been the Icelandic parliament, which was called the All Thing. And what a thing was a meeting of people to decide about a matter that was as yet undecided and that required attention. And it was thus a matter of talking, deliberating, and reaching a conclusion. And I was first put on to thinking about this by Abraham Heschel's marvelous book, The Sabbath, in which he talks about the nature of time. And he says we're obsessed with the grandeur of space. So we think of time as being a sort of large building in which things happen. But it's not a thing. And indeed, there's a problem with our conceiving the world as made up of things, as I believe there is. And he points out that in Hebrew, the word davar, which I think is what is used now as the word for a thing, started off meaning a matter to be decided, a debate, a point of view, possibly a gift, but an exchange of something between people that was not necessarily concrete at all and was effectively undecided. And yet it has become the way in which we describe things that seem most completed, finished, and concrete. And this is also the same in other languages. So that in Romance languages, the word chose or cosa in Italian, and I think the same in Spanish, come from the Latin word causa, which means a cause in the sense of something you would plead before a court, your cause, or a cause that you feel is a worthy one to give your time and effort to putting forward, to furthering. So that in every case, it seems, in Hebrew, and you can find the same thing in Latin and in Greek, where the words that ended up, for example, res, which means in Latin a thing, began meaning a matter under debate, which is why letters often begin re something or other. It used to be in re, in the matter of this thing. And so it's in every language that we know, or I know, whether it be Hebrew, Greek, Latin, the Icelandic, Norse languages, and in the Germanic languages and Romance languages, it's had this same process of beginning as a reciprocal, indeterminate process in time and ending up as an abstraction out of time.
How fascinating. And since you mentioned it in Latin, and we're still stuck in a way with the division between res cogitans and res extensa. Maybe what we're trying to do here is to say that res is both cogitans and extensa.
Yes, it is. That's a very nice point. That's a lovely point. Yes, because it is. And what I'm saying is that these matters, as we call them, and of course, fascinatingly, the word matter, I mean, the title of my book is The Matter with Things, and in it are puns on our obsession with the material and our obsession with the thing-like in our world. Whereas I believe that the important things are processes in reality, and we need to incorporate into our idea of the world things that are, as we say, not necessarily material, although maybe the distinction between consciousness and matter is, well, we'll talk about that in another chapter, but in any case, yes, that's lovely. And it really, in a way, suggests that it's the thingification of the world that happened at this time, the reification that caused some of the problem.
Yes.
And I think I also make the point, which is worth a moment's reflection, that Greek imported the possibility of a definite article, which actually, interestingly, there isn't in Latin, but in Greek there is. And so there can be not just a beautiful face, a beautiful mountain, a beautiful tree, but there can be the beautiful. So by the time you put the in front of it, you've created an abstraction from any of the things that you actually really see that have the quality of being beautiful. So it's gone from its adjectival status as beautiful, or its adverbial status as beautifully, to an abstract noun, the beautiful. And apparently there's still very few abstract nouns in Japanese. And I'm told that in old Japanese there weren't even abstractions for good and bad. It was inherent in the nature of what one was judging as good or bad that it had to be contextualized in the real world. So that is interesting as an aside, I think.
Yes, an aside, but what a point mutation in the human psyche when these things happen, don't you think?
Oh, indeed. Which is why it's always good to do a bit of archaeology on where our ideas come from and how they've changed over time. I find it intriguing anyway,
Now you write about different shapes of time. The usual standard one, the most specialized of all, is the straight line, the chains of causality. But then you also talk, of
Yes.
course, about the circular and the spiral, the helical, and also the one that's collective, that's embodied, that's social rhythm.
Yes. 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 So that in cultures, pre-modern cultures, um, time has more of a circular shape with the passing of the seasons that bring all the important changes for people's lives close to nature. And most religious traditions have a calendar which is cyclical. So one sees that circularity embodied. But nowadays we think of time as a line that you can draw on a graph, and before, to the left of a certain point is the past, and to the right of a certain point is the future. And of course, the mythos of the modern world is that there is always progress and that change is always from worse towards better. Logically, there is absolutely no reason why it should be like that. It's just as likely that it could be the reverse of progress, but there we are. But in any case, as you know, I like the helical image because it brings together the idea of a progress forward that doesn't ever repeat with this idea of circling something. So you get beyond that image.
Which leads us into
And
Bergson again.
yes, indeed.
Should we change gears and become more metaphysical, or do you want to linger a bit more on this very natural in a way? Because we're talking about something that's quite natural, but unfortunately, to be able to talk about it, we need to go hardcore metaphysical to kind of rescue time from this specialization.
We do, because Bergson said more clearly than anyone that it is the spatialization of time that denatures it and devitalizes the world. He makes this very clear that when you see time as it really is, as a process that is constant, that it is the only constant, is the changing process of time.
Yeah.
One of the great physicists of the 20th century, and I can't now remember precisely which, said the one thing that is permanent is change. The present is the only everlasting thing. So that is another way of thinking about it. And I suppose before we go into Bergson, it might just be worth making a few comments on Bergson, because there's a lot of ill-informed misconceptions about Bergson, as a result of which, until quite recently, he was very much neglected. And it's a bit of a puzzle because at the beginning of the 20th century, he was probably the most important intellectual in the world. He won a Nobel Prize. He was more famous than Einstein. And when he lectured in New York, he was credited with causing the first traffic jam in New York. And he, for some reason, because I think of the debate that took place between Einstein and Bergson in Paris in 1922, was it?
100 years ago, this April, yes.
100 years ago this April, yes. And that itself is just worth a few comments. For those who are interested in knowing more, I do strongly recommend the book by Jimena Canales called, I think, The Philosopher and the Physicist, or The Physicist and the Philosopher. I can't remember which. But in any case, it tells this story, what led up to it and what happened since, and the sort of almost deliberate concealing of the value of what Bergson was illustrating. And in the latter half of the 20th century, people began to see that Bergson's grasp of physics was profound. But in any case, at the point that they were debating, Bergson didn't in any way disagree with what Einstein had to say. He was talking at a different level, not just about clock time, but about phenomenological time. And so he wasn't in conflict with Einstein, but Einstein seems to have misunderstood what Bergson was saying and said in a very dismissive way, the time of the philosophers is unreal. But it could equally be said that the time of the clockmaker is unreal. We have to juggle, because of the way our brains are set up, different ways of thinking about time. But there's no question that Bergson was there's been some thought that he could be anti-scientific, and this is so ironic, based simply on an urban myth, which is the story of the debate between Bergson and Einstein, in which some people think that Bergson didn't understand Einstein, but I think more importantly, Einstein didn't understand Bergson. Bergson probably did understand Einstein. Because of that, it's thought that he was somehow anti-scientific, but I can't actually think of any philosopher in the last 150 years who was more thorough in his interest in knowledge of mathematics and physics. And de Broglie even said that his doctoral thesis, Time and Free Will, which was published in 1889, I think, that this was, antedates, his perceptions antedate by 40 years, those of Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, on the physical interpretation of wave mechanics. And what's really important about that is that, as de Broglie also points out, in quantum mechanics, a particle represents a point precisely located in geometric space with no motion, which is of course impossible because everything is always moving. And the wave represents motion in a pure state with no spatial location, so that the particle is in denial of motion. And it is interesting to think about that when we come in a future chapter to talk about the nature of space and matter.
Indeed. And there's this fabulous book by Milik Capek, Bergson and Modern Physics, which is an absolute joy to read. And as a physicist, I was reading it, it's like, wow, I never thought of physics this way. Of course, when I was studying it, I was much younger, but now having read Bergson and then Capek's book, it's like, you could see the true pioneering understanding that Bergson had. Of course, he didn't know about quantum physics, it hadn't happened yet. But not just of physics, of in matter and memory, 26 years ago, on perception, on memory, on consciousness. So Bergson is totally relevant and urgently needed today to make sense of so many fields. Yes.
Yes, in fact, if somebody said to me off the cuff, which philosopher of the last 100 years is most important to read, it's quite probably Bergson, despite the fact of there being many other great ones, of course, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Scheler, and so on. But I would really say he's one of the most important. Sorry.
I'm going to say, before we move on, I want to make two comments about the history of ideas here. So first, Bergson is paradoxically the paradigmatic case of cancel culture. I mean, his ideas were absolutely, rejected, ridiculized consistently for decades. It's not just the clash with Einstein. Then there's the kind of amnesia that Bertrand Russell and the critique of Bertrand Russell, and then some of the major biologists of the last century, they use every possible opportunity to dismiss the élan vital in a casual sentence. I mean, we hear it all the time. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I think it permeates from Jimena Canales' book, is that this clash between Bergson and Einstein seems to be, well, then maybe that's more my interpretation than what she says, but embodies kind of the definite split between science and philosophy, between these two modes of thinking that were kind of integrated, and then they split. And as I like to say, if history is written by the winners, then Einstein won. And from then on, it was this view of the world that smells like scientism. It's like, here comes the physicist, and he's going to tell us what time is. Because, of course, what do philosophers know? We have left that thing aside, luckily. And that's really the moment, like, we can even put a date. That's why it's so significant. I think it was the 6th of April, 1922. That was like the beginning of the end. And in a way, that's what we're trying to bring together. And what you also as a person, as a scholar, I think you embody that these two, at least, ways of thinking can live and thrive together.
They must do, in fact. And as Ian Whitehead said, the divorce between metaphysics and science is one of the worst family quarrels, and has been to the detriment of both parties. So I think, yes, building the bridges again, and physicists have, certainly in recent times, well really since 100 years, have been foremost among scientists in building bridges with philosophy, and I do think that they can complement one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I'd like to say is that things, they seem to us fundamental. In fact, we even call them in grammar substantive, and that means that they underlie things. They literally stand under what it is that we see. But reality, as according to the right hemisphere and according to what Bergson and James are putting forward, is continuous and indivisible, and it doesn't need things to underpin it. The things supervene on the flow. The things are processes, extremely rapid vibrations within the world, as we now know, from physics. And we might have thought of this in philosophical terms, because if one believes that everything exists as it is, it cannot be divorced from the way in which we perceive it and understand it, then there is always a to and fro, what I call a betweenness or an encounter, that in which both parties are changed. So contrary to the idea of static things underlying our appearances, there is that the appearance of reality is truly, is real. It is continuous and indivisible. That is what is there. The things are imaginary. They are the bits that are useful. When I say imaginary, of course, I use the word things all the time, like everyone else, and it's a very useful shorthand. But what one is basically doing is looking at things that protrude out of this network that is constantly changing and flowing.
And since you said very useful shorthand, this is perfect, because we're back to the hand, and also very useful. It has to do with utility, which is precisely the way to embrace what you could say the left hemisphere, in this case, Bergson's critique of time, also integrates, which is we need that specialization of time, because that's how we can survive and get along in the real world and do things. But let's not forget that there's something more than that. And if we lose that, then no matter how well we're surviving, there's this devitalization. The word loses its vitality. And also as you're presenting all this extensive literature and also on patients, that's also manifested there. So again, this dualism that needs to be properly balanced, but utility is essential, not to just dismiss that time we're critiquing here.
Absolutely, and I was astonished when I found Bergson saying so long ago that this take on time and movement that makes it a thing, and a static thing at that, is merely designed to suit utility, because he's really talking, without knowing that he was, about the left hemisphere's need to immobilize, to split up, in order to instrumentalize the world. It's extraordinary that he reached, one of the things that I keep saying is that long before anybody knew very much about the functioning of the brain and the hemispheres, and certainly long before there were scanners, people by introspection could see these differences and even understand their nature, and which of these senses or visions of the world was more likely to be true. There's a trade-off here between what is true and complex on the one hand and what is simple and useful on the other.
Yes.
And he maintained that change was the most substantial and durable thing possible. Quite the reverse, that it was always something, and that the things that we think of as things were becomings, not beings. They were things coming into being.
Yeah. And there are some koans there. Well, maybe they're not koans, but at least phrases Bergson uses to really try to convey that through his writing. And that's one of the reasons why he got a Nobel Prize in Literature, probably. And I just want to mention some of them, because they're hard, but they're beautiful, right?
Yes.
So, and you also write them in this chapter, like these ideas of succession without distinction. Mutual penetration is another one. The notion of multiplicity, how to understand that. Another one is heterogeneous continuity. So it's not a continuity, it's not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. And this is really, juicy stuff, not just for the mind to entertain, but for our own everyday lives. If we could only grasp, have a sense for what those things are really trying to tell us about time.
Absolutely. And again, James talked in much the same terms about the way in which what I love about what you just said, and I want to emphasize, is the coming together of multiplicity with unity, what we talked about in was it our last talk, really? Yes. How the process of time does this. It shows us how there can be differentiation within unity, not the breaking up into chunks, never that, but instead this unfolding or unfurling. And I come back to that image that Bergson has, where he says that the process of time is not like the unfolding of a lady's fan, on which, when, as you see it unfold, you see the picture coming into being, because that's the picture that was already painted there all the time. But this is a truly creative process that is not closed, but is not random either. That it's a creative process that brings things into being for us, and it's imaginative. It's that same distinction I've made before between imagination on the one hand, which is truly open and creative, and fantasy, which is a process of just decorating or clothing the normal take on reality in a new way.
Yes, absolutely. This unfurling, again, resists proper understanding, because there's a tendency to think of it as a unfurling carpet, whereby it's already there. So it's a carpet, or it's like cinema. And that's why also Bergson wrote about the cinematographical illusion, and then Deleuze took on it. Whereas we're trying to say it's not cinema or carpet, it is some sort of continuous creation, right? It's a continuous creation.
It is. It is. And that is very strongly associated with vitality, which comes back to this expression, the élan vital, because immobilizing and fixing things, as in schizophrenia, leads to a sense of lifelessness, of life being a thing that is observed, not an experience that's inhabited. And so they have lost, schizophrenic subjects have lost that feeling of being in time's flow. And Bergson writes rather movingly about when one realizes this sense that the flow is primary and is the important thing, that the world unfreezes, he says, and it comes back to life. And these are images also used by William James. Somewhere he talks about, analysis kind of basically being a post-mortem process whereby we cut things up and put them in display cases, but that the life of them cannot be caught. And he uses the image of a net, however fine. You can't, the river is real, but with that net, you cannot bring up the water, because the water just drips through the net that's designed to contain it.
How powerful and simple image,
Yes, but terribly true, I think.
And what's going on all the time, from like everyday life all the way to biology, studying organisms and so on, it's a sort of vivisection of being. Like we're constantly splitting not only the atom, but the organisms we study, life itself, and our very concepts are also vivisections, even though we're not using an instrument like a surgeon, right? There's this vivisection of being, which in a way, it's paradoxical, because you need to do it. But if you only do that, then the very thing you're trying to study has died. It's gone. It's another thing.
Yes. I mean, that reminds me of Wordsworth's expression, we murder to dissect. But of course, the good news is that if one can only remain with oneself firmly rooted in the right hemisphere's world, one can venture safely into what the left hemisphere can show, which is important and contributes to our understanding, but taking it back, never allowing it just to sit there in that dead realm, but taking it back into the area of life, redeeming it, if you like. and that's this right to left to right process that I'm constantly talking about.
It's worthwhile repeating it as many times, even every time we discuss, because through this repetition, I think we are the rest of us getting it. I think we're getting it. I hope so.
Yeah, yeah. And this idea is very important. It's there in Leibniz, who thought that the essence of a body was not its extension in space, but its motion. He actually says the essence of a body is motion.
Wow.
So that I mean, back in the 17th century, he was seeing motion as the primary element. And we now know that the motion of a matter field in physics is not differentiable into its parts. It cannot be further differentiated without loss of the essential element in it. And I think that if you think about, and here I would ask you, Alex, to correct me, but I mean, if, as I understand it, what lies behind all the phenomena that we perceive are fields of energy, force fields, quantum fields, this casts a great light on the idea of causation, because, I mean, particularly taking the example of entanglement, the peculiar idea of entanglement that seems so difficult for people to understand is so-called spooky action at a distance that we now know has to be accepted. Because how can something have an influence on something else that is farther distant in space than time will allow for something to be transmitted? And the way I, as an outsider, try to make sense of this is that it is because they're both parts of a whole, and there is actually literally no time required to change it, because it's like the turn of a kaleidoscope in which the image changes all at once, not one part causing another change. And I actually illustrate this with a visual illusion, one of those pictures that can be seen two ways. It can be seen as a woman's face, it can be seen as a flower. And it's not that one part of it can be seen as, oh, that's a butterfly, not lips. That's not the side of her face, that is a leaf, or whatever it is. It's not that one bit causes you to see the next. Instantaneously, you shift gestalt. And I think it's not too much to imagine that in the universe there are these wholes which are greater than engineered chains of causation, in which when you change one part, you change the other instantly. As when a couple get married, one of them doesn't marry the other, which causes the other one to marry them. They just get married at the same moment, and one becomes a husband and the other becomes a wife, or whatever it is. So that is the nature of what I'm talking about here.
What a surprise again, right? That by getting deeper into causality, we end up back in wholeness. Let me explain that. And as you were mentioning, entanglement, and since you just said this from right to left and back, well, maybe a very quick way to summarize the business of causation in physics is that, well, we may begin with correlation, but then from it we want to extract causation. This seems to be like the gold we search for at the river. But then the further you study causation, you realize you may want to transcend it, or give it up in a very weird way, because there are some principles that are acausal. And actually entanglement is not to be imagined, again, as you're saying, like some electron sending a secret signal, like, sending a dove kind of to the other one. And that's what defies, again, the intellect. So we go from this notion of external impacts to some sort of internal sympathy with things. And so the way to think about these two entangled particles, the way to think about it is, well, they're not two entangled particles, or maybe they are, but what they are is a whole. So if you're talking about one, you're at the same time talking about the other. So your example of the partner is so lovely. When you're talking about a couple, you're talking about both. So if you talk about one, how surprised should you be that you're also, in a way, saying things or affecting things on the other side, because they're one whole.
Yes, and organic flow is in this sense, again, different from mechanical causation. If we go back to Bergson's idea about a musical melody, the notes that are yet to come in the melody do alter the notes that went before. In the presence of what has come after, they become different from what they were before. So that there is, as it were, retrospective causation. And he gives the example, which I think is quite a nice one in the history of ideas, that as we look back on it, we can see in the emergence of Romanticism elements of what was to become Romanticism within Classicism. But of course, if Romanticism had never occurred, we would not see those elements of Romanticism in Classicism. That may sound rather abstract, but let's move to some very physical thing, like a waterfall or a tornado. What is it that causes the tornado? What is it that causes the waterfall? The waterfall is an easy one to think of. Is it the rain that fell over weeks or months? Is it the land rift which causes there to be a huge drop and the waterfall goes down? Can any part of this be immobilized and said this is the cause of it? The thing is as a whole constant and flowing, and when it stops, simply the whole thing dries up. So it's like a flame that, as J.B.S. Halden said, that all organisms are like flames, that you can blow it out, but you can't reconstitute it. It's not made by one thing. It is what it is as a whole. And I reflect in this chapter on, what is the cause of the sound of a trumpet? Well, is it the trumpet itself, or is it the mouth of the trumpeter, or is it the wind from the lungs? Is it the lungs of the trumpeter? Or is it the person who made the trumpet? Or is it Handel who wrote the music? Or is it all these people's parents for bringing them into being? Yeah. Or is it even the concert that will take place tomorrow evening that is causing the sound now that I'm hearing from the practicing trumpeter? What are the causes of this endless process? I think it's easier to see in any kind of living example that that elements of causation do not necessarily follow a linear chain. And I believe, and I again emphasize, I'm not a physicist, that it has been shown in physics that sometimes an effect can be its own cause. That takes me into a realm I can't be confident of.
Well, and in biology too, because the very notion of an organism as thought by the great theoretical biologists who are forgotten.
Yes.
Kurt Goldstein and Canguilhem and the
yes.
others. Well, an organism is sometimes defined, and it's hard to define, but self-caused is this entity that is self-caused. So because of these circular loops that act on the environment, but to take it in a more organic sense, not in a purely cybernetic sense, like a machine that outputs and then receives feedback, but as a thing that's maintaining itself, producing itself. All the great notions in biology are about have this self-referentiality in them. And, you don't need to go to weird quantum processes. It's like animals in front of you are doing it.
Thank you for that. You're so right. And we talked about this when talking about chapter 12 on the nature of an organism, that one part of it doesn't bring another part into existence, but the whole thing differentiates within itself. And that parts that appear disconnected can sense the nature of the whole and take active steps to remedy something when it needs to be remedied. So that is extraordinary, yes. Yeah.
Yes. Let me make a side note. I know we're going back, but I can't refrain from saying something about quantum mechanics. I think I recently read that David Bohm was unsatisfied with how with the name quantum mechanics, and he'd rather have called it quantum organics, because it's anything but mechanical. But because we were coming from classical mechanics, this is quantum, we hoped with an adjective we could convey, but it was organic. It is organic.
Yes.
So it's more organic than most would like to acknowledge. And even quantum, which of course have to do with the jams, the discrete jams and energy transfer and so on. Well, it's one part of it, but it's also very continuous in a way. So you see, even quantum mechanics is tricking us into understanding it. It's more about the kind of an organic flow we're talking about here.
No, that's absolutely right. And I sort of riff on what Bohm said, which was it should be called quantum non-mechanics. I said, well, actually, really, it should be called non-quantum non-mechanics. Because, as you know, I talk about this perception by David Tong, I think his name is, a professor of physics at Cambridge, that he sees no evidence for discontinuity in nature, that when one looks at things ultimately and deeply, one sees that there is continuity, which is not to say there is non-differentiation. Once again, this important distinction between, of course there is, and wonderfully there is differentiation without separation, without sundering. That is so important as an idea.
I read the quantum organics from you, actually. Now I recall. So I said I had read recently.
Okay.
Well, I read it from you, actually, what Bohm says. So now you made me remember. It came through your own writing. Thank you for that.
Well, good.
It is. I'm bringing it forth as is. By the way, Ian, it's like.
Thank you.
Oh, I read it from you, actually.
No, look, that's fine. We share all our thoughts. As Shayla says, where are thoughts? Are they in my head, in your head? No, they're in the coming together of the heads,
Yes.
Or the minds, yes. So there we are, yes. Well, there are a lot of things we could talk about. Perhaps we should talk about... Well, we could talk about the subjective appreciation of time. I think we could talk about the ways in which physicists think of time.
Yeah.
The
subjective aspect. Let's say a few words about it. Impatience. There's no impatience in mathematical physics, but there's a lot in our lives. And then I like that passage that Anna Arendt writes about forgiveness and hope as the ways in which from the present we can, travel in time and do things where otherwise nothing could be done. So these three words, at least, impatience, forgiveness, and hope, immediately could ground our discussion into something very human and humane, and not so much about quantum mechanics and relativity. And it needs to be said, because that's what really matters. The matter with things, that's what does matter for real people? Those subjective qualities.
You're so right. And of course, the Buddha said that the greatest prayer is patience, something I often tell myself and have cause to tell myself. But you're quite right that when we are impatient, when we are unforgiving, when we lack hope, then time alters its feel, alters its quality, and becomes an impediment, really, to the appreciation of life. I mean, yes, I mean, there's a lot could be said about that in relation to the way we feel about time now. We're so driven by clocks, we're so driven by the sense that we've only got so many hours to do something, and we've got to achieve it, and we have so many goals that we try to fit into one period of time. And it results in dissatisfaction, feeling of stress, feeling of, incompleteness, and ADHD is a modern condition, it seems, and it's very much a right hemisphere deficit condition in which people they're not able to focus for any period of time. Their attention is seized constantly by this and that and the other.
Yes.
But fortunately, there are ways in which we can counter that, and interestingly, it relates to why time speeds up as one gets older. I think that when one's young, one is constantly anticipating a new future, and one is hopeful, and one sees potential there all the time. What is to come is exciting, whereas the past is hardly of interest. But as one gets older, the future becomes less congenial. Certainly one's personal future becomes more problematic, and the things that matter to us have roots in the past, and so we're drawn more towards the past than into the flow of things. Also, I think that we tend to be less absorbed. Part of what I was just saying is that we're less absorbed in what we do. When one is capable of being absorbed in things, it has a wonderful healing quality. One stops worrying about time and one starts to feel that time is companionable and open. One can sit in a natural scene and it seems timeless. If one is doing something like playing music with people or dancing with people, or anything that takes you up into that other, whatever it is, then time becomes less of a problem. And I think that when people are young, they perhaps are more capable of that absorption, and that due to the anxieties and stresses we have about everything that has to be administered and organized and so on, that we're taken out of the flow of time. And I think the other thing is that we can recapture it a bit through the effect of newness. One of the things I notice, I'm sure everyone else does, that if you go to somewhere you've never been before for 2 days, it feels like an age that you've been there. You think, can it only have been 2 days ago that we did whatever it was? And it seems like it's a long period of time, because you know, when something is familiar, the left hemisphere goes, yes, one of those, got it in my box, you know, and it bypasses the business of, hang on, the right hemisphere is actually here to experience this, and it's harder to do when things are familiar.
Yes, we need those kind of to swim or plunge or step again into these rivers of durée, right? There are many occasions.
Yes.
And maybe
Because I often
just to add, you were mentioning, you started this conversation with James' quote with this expression, time is the field force of individuation. Was it something like that? Now it's
certainly my words. I think maybe from him as
or
well.
maybe it's your own words. Okay, again.
Yes.
now instead of
I don't know.
Instead of a carpet, we can think of that time force of individuation as a snowball. I think Bergson uses this image. So as the snowball is rolling downhill, it can grow and it accumulates its own past, right? Now maybe as we grow old, this snowball has a lot of the past in it. And maybe there's a tendency to, you know, then be less able to be present.
Yes, well, that's right. And the idea of that growing ball makes me think of the different ways in which physicists tend to theorize about time. And one way that it carries a lot of people these days in the physics world is that of Einstein's idea of a block universe, really, in which past, present and future are all really present at the same time in a way, in a block. And but as the philosopher John Lucas points out, this has nothing of the qualities of time about it. It doesn't account for the passage of time. It doesn't account for the salience of now. It doesn't account for the feeling that the past is growing and the future is unknowable, that the asymmetry between them. It really doesn't have much going for it, in my view. There is another way of thinking about it, which is presentism, which is a kind of constant series of slices. So there is only the now that is now. The past and the future are imaginary. But this is not really right, because as in the flow of life, the stream, the melody, whatever it is, the past is shaping what is here now, and we're very well aware of it, and it helps to lead on to the future. So a compromise position that has been suggested is that of the growing block, and that at least carries with it the idea of something that is expanding, in which the past and the present are real. Only the future is as yet unreal as this block grows. But what I particularly like is the image of George Ellis, a physicist who describes the idea of an evolving universe of space-time in which that volume is always growing, and that the present is like the surface of this expanding volume. That is where the present is. It's always at that interface between the universe, the globe that is of all that has evolved, and what is still without it and to come.
These are all fascinating abstractions. They have their own merit. But
Yes.
well, not maybe not the last one. Well, the last one is also an abstraction, but the first ones, which are I would say the dominant ones in physics, have this key pitfall, which is again one of the reasons Bergson was protesting against Einstein, which is, so you're going to tell us then that too bad for you, poor humans, and your own experience. Basically, all the qualities that you can name about time, and we said a few, hope and impatience. Well, they can only be some sort of illusions because time itself is, it may be even an illusion. Like maybe if the past is equal to the present is equal to the future, then what's the point? They seem to be illusory. If there's only a present, then we've lost the distinction between memory and perception, the past and the present. So how to honor our deep, our most intimate felt experience with the most sophisticated abstractions in physics and mathematics. It's a huge challenge.
Well, I think there is a huge challenge, and it's nicely pinned down by the philosopher Yuval Dolev, who says to regard time as a mistake is to discredit experience to such an extent that empirical science has nothing trustworthy to feed on. Discrediting experience to such an extent fatally cripples, he says, the very mechanisms through which the theory of relativity was arrived at to begin with. We can't discredit something that is so fundamental because we've got nothing with which to remove something so fundamental. And Lee Smolin, who I do think has written more cogently about time, he's a physicist, of course, than anyone I know, says not only is time real, but nothing we know or experience gets closer to the heart of nature than the reality of time. I profoundly believe that. And fortunately, it's in harmony with the views of Dogen, great 12th, 13th century Zen mystic, who said that without time there could be no mountains, no rivers, and even that there could be nothing at all. It could come into existence. Lao Tzu also suggests this, and Aristotle, although I don't think his world picture could really encapsulate what it is we're now talking about, quotes the poet Agathon as saying, even God cannot unmake what has been done. And I know that there is a book by a theologian which its entire theme is that it's a mistake to imagine that God can do away with or even exist without time. So it's sort of fundamental. And a lot of people will get very upset about that for reasons that one understands. We seem attached to going on and on and on and on. Personally, I'm not. It all depends on the portion size. We've all got to go at some point. And would going on and on and on, literally forever, and having no out from existence ever be better than having a moment when we're no longer here? I think not. And after that, it's just a question of, well, is the current portion size all right? I think it's quite good, actually. So I don't see it as a tyrant. I see time as a liberator. It's the one that gives us freedom, because in a timeless world, everything would already be known and fixed, and there would be no movement. There could be no change. There could be nothing that we can conceivably imagine could come into being without that business of time.
Maybe as Terence McKenna would say, time is your friend.
Yes, I certainly believe that. Yes, I agree with that. It is our friend. And as a doctor, I can also say that from the days when I was doing general medicine with quite an aged population, that, death, I think wisdom is to come to see that death is the terms on which we have life, and that life cannot exist without death any more than the negative pole can exist without the positive pole, and so forth.
Now, I know I was going to say, I know we've covered a lot, and there's much more in the chapters, just as a reminder for the reader. But since you mentioned God, I can't refrain from asking you to expand on what's the place of God in time, or maybe better the other way around? What's the place of time in God's mind? I mean, how do we? And I'm sorry for being the last question because it's like it
No.
blows up another hour of discussion, but at least to have some glimpses of how to conceive of God. It's a very crucial question for theologians, I would suppose. Like, if we take, let's say, put it this way, if we take time, and I'm not gonna, let's not entertain those who portray God as the old man in like, let's forget about the teenager popular scientism, whatever. If we take time seriously, what happens with our understanding of God?
Well, I mean, as you say, an hour might be less than enough for this, but fortunately you leave me virtually speechless, so it shouldn't be too big a problem. I think what one has to hang on to here is that when one talks about God, one is already venturing into a realm in which our conceptions and our language are going to be too limited. But one way of thinking of it is that if truly all things are one, as well as there being many, we talked about that in our last discussion, then certainly to God, everything exists together, because when one part of something has done the expression of its thisness, it is that thisness of that thing or that person, you or me, goes back into, is retained by the newly complexified whole as another part of whatever is. So everything that exists has its date, as it were. It doesn't go on forever, but while it exists, it adds to the wholeness. Now, the human mind cannot perceive this wholeness. It can possibly conceive it with difficulty just by uttering the words, well, all things are one. But actually, if we try to take it further and understand it, it's extraordinarily difficult. I suppose that what we are saying is that to the consciousness of God, which is the all we can do is come up with the term we use called eternity, which is not just an extension of time. I think that's extremely important. Just as infinity is not an extension of the series of numbers. We don't get to eternity by climbing up the staircase of numbers. We don't get to eternity by adding more time. What we're talking about here is a different realm of being, which, being temporal beings and finite beings, is necessarily hard for us to discuss, but for which many people, most people since time began, and at least we're able to articulate their thinking, have included as important elements to take into account. You might think of them as like the way in which in mathematics one can use the concept of infinity, and one can use the concept of a complex number such as an irrational number, and an imaginary number, such as I, the square root of -1. You can use it in order to make calculations. You don't ever have to say, I understand what the square root of -1 is. Nobody can say what the square root of -1 is, but it can be incorporated into structures that we do understand and not end up in nonsense. So what I think is that this idea of the eternal, this idea of the infinite, is a gift to us which we can use in our language as long as we don't worry about the fact that we can't rephrase it in other words. It would be extraordinary if we could. Language isn't the be-all and end-all. It's only the starting place for the simplest things that we can talk about. Most of the really important ones simply cannot be encompassed in language. And here I think back to the poet Blake, both because about time he was very good. He said, I think he said, eternity is in love with the productions of time. And I think what his meaning is, getting back to this idea that something that is whole loves, in a real sense, is connected to and values those productions of individuation that we've been talking about. He also thought of the hours that we think we measure with a clock. He said the hours of folly are measured by the clock, but of wisdom no clock can measure. And he was making the distinction between quantifying time and the experience of time, the wise view of time, that it is an endless experience, whereas the hours are countable and finite units, like the numbers. And in his poetry, the word infinite and the word eternal constantly recur. He was always talking about them, and what he did not mean was something that was different in quantity, but something that was different in quality. And that, of course, is, again, a left-right hemisphere distinction. The left is interested in how much, how many quantity, more than it is in differentiating the qualities of individual cases, whereas the right hemisphere is the one that really appreciates qualitative differences and is better at it. And so I would see this as the right hemisphere's take on eternity and infinity as being qualitative changes to the way in which we think and understand, probably not just even think, but believe and feel a connection towards in our heart or soul as much as in our head. That therefore these concepts are not without meaning, but they're not of the kind of meaning that can be spelt out in the way that I hope you didn't want me to in answer to your question, because I don't think it's possible.
Well, and in a way you passed the test of the hemispheres, because the way you're articulating that really preaches with example what your whole book is saying, right? How to live and make sense of the world by putting the hemispheres in the right place. And there's yet another fantastic quote I take for meditation from you, which is with respect to our own mortality. You just said we don't get to eternity by adding more time.
No,
I think that's just perfect to wrap it up.
Yes. Yep. And yet eternity can exist or may exist, I really don't know. There are many things I don't know, many more of them than there were a few years ago.
It's a good sign. It's a good sign. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex.